The courtroom was full. People whispered as they waited for the judge to arrive. Mrs. Whitmore sat in the front row, looking bored. She was dressed in an expensive suit and held her head high. She believed this case was a joke. She thought it would be over quickly. After all, she was rich and powerful. No judge would dare punish her. The door opened. A court officer announced, "All rise for Judge Carter." Mrs. Whitmore stood lazily, rolling her eyes. She turned to look at the judge's seat. Then her face froze. Her heart skipped a beat. It was him. The old black man she had insulted on the road. The same man she had knocked into the canal last night. Judge Carter walked in, wearing his black robe. His eyes were calm, but firm. He looked directly at Mrs. Whitmore. She swallowed hard. Beads of sweat formed on her forehead. The whispers in the courtroom grew louder. People noticed her sudden change. Mrs. Whitmore's hands trembled. She had no idea this man was a judge. She thought he was just an old, poor cyclist. Now, he was the one with power. He was the one who would decide her fate. The sun was just rising. The streets were still quiet. Mr. Carter, an old black man, rode his bicycle to work. He enjoyed the cool morning air. His bike was old but strong. He had used it for many years. As he pedaled forward, a loud car horn shattered the silence. A shiny black luxury car sped up behind him. The driver honked again, impatiently. Mr. Carter stayed calm and kept riding. The road was wide. There was enough space for both of them. The car swerved sharply and pulled up beside him. The tinted window rolled down. A woman with sharp features and expensive sunglasses glared at him. It was Mrs. Whitmore. Her face was twisted with anger. "Move out of my way, old man!" she shouted. "People like you shouldn't block the road." Mr. Carter turned his head slightly. He looked at her, but said nothing. His face remained calm. He had heard insults like this before. He had learned to stay patient. Mrs. Whitmore was not used to being ignored. Her hands tightened on the steering wheel. "Are you deaf? Get off the road," she snapped. Mr. Carter sighed but kept riding. He was not breaking any rules. The road was for everyone. Mrs. Whitmore groaned in frustration. She slammed her foot on the gas and sped past him. As she drove away, she muttered to herself, "This day has started terribly." She had no idea that this was just the beginning. Mrs. Whitmore's day was just getting started, and it was clear she was in no mood for kindness. She walked into her office, wearing her expensive suit, head held high. She was a woman of power, and everyone knew it. Her high heels clicked on the floor as she made her way through the building. People moved out of her way, too afraid to speak up. At her desk, she began her work. Emails flooded in, but she didn't care much for them. Instead, she focused on her next meeting. It was with a few of her business partners, but she already knew what would happen. They would listen to her, agree with her, and leave her office feeling small. When the meeting started, Mrs. Whitmore sat back in her chair, confident. She spoke loudly, not bothering to listen to others. She dismissed their ideas as unimportant. Everything was about her. Everything revolved around her wealth and status. As the hours passed, Mrs. Whitmore grew more and more pleased with herself. She made cruel jokes about people below her, laughing with her colleagues. "Those poor people have no idea how lucky they are to be in my presence," she thought. She took a break for lunch and ordered food from a high-end restaurant. She treated the waitstaff like servants, demanding her food be perfect. "I don't expect mistakes," she said, sending a waiter away with a harsh glare. She looked at her watch. The day was moving slowly, but she didn't mind. After all, she believed everything would go her way. No one would dare stand in her way, or so she thought. As she left the office, her mood was still high. But little did she know, life was about to teach her a lesson. The evening was calm, and the air was cool as Mr. Carter made his way home. The sun was setting, casting a warm glow over the city. He cycled slowly along the quiet street, enjoying the peaceful end to his long day. He passed by the Canal Bridge, a spot he knew well. It was always quiet here, with only the sound of water flowing beneath the bridge. As Mr. Carter reached the middle of the bridge, he heard the familiar sound of a car engine revving. He glanced over his shoulder and saw a black luxury car speeding toward him. He felt a sense of unease, but he kept riding, not wanting to hurry. The bridge was narrow, and there wasn't much room for both of them. The car got closer. Mr. Carter tried to stay steady, but the driver wasn't waiting. Without any warning, the car swerved toward him, hitting his bicycle hard. Mr. Carter lost his balance. His hands slipped off the handlebars. He tried to stay on his feet, but it was no use. He crashed into the side of the bridge and then fell straight into the cold canal below. The shock of the fall took his breath away. Water splashed around him as he struggled to stay above the surface. His bicycle sank into the water, floating away. As he paddled, trying to keep his head above the water, he saw the car stop on the bridge. The window rolled down, and the woman inside looked at him. It was Mrs. Whitmore. Instead of stopping to help, she laughed. "Get out of the way next time," she shouted, not even bothering to check if he was okay. Then she drove off, leaving him struggling in the cold water. Mr. Carter pulled himself to the edge of the canal. He was wet and bruised, but he was alive. He watched as the car disappeared into the distance, not knowing who she really was or what would happen next. The next morning, Mrs. Whitmore received a letter in the mail. It was an official notice from the court. She had been summoned to appear for a hearing. The letter explained the incident on the canal bridge and asked her to come to court. At first, she didn't think much of it. She was sure the case would be dismissed quickly. After all, she was a wealthy, powerful woman. When the day arrived, she walked into the courtroom with a confident smile. She was sure no one could touch her. The room was full of people, but her eyes were focused only on the judge's seat. She expected a quick trial with no real consequences. The courtroom doors opened, and everyone stood up. Mrs. Whitmore was about to sit down when she suddenly froze. Her heart skipped a beat. The judge who entered the room was none other than Mr. Carter, the same old black man she had insulted and pushed into the canal the evening before. At first, she thought it was a mistake. She blinked several times trying to understand what was happening. But no, it was him. Mr. Carter stood tall in his black robe, his face calm and serious. He was the judge, the one who would decide her fate. Mrs. Whitmore's face turned pale. Her mind raced. She never imagined he was anything more than a poor old man riding a bicycle. She had no idea that he was a senior judge, one who could bring real justice. The courtroom was silent, and all eyes were on her. Mrs. Whitmore felt a cold sweat on her forehead. She tried to sit up straight, but her hands were shaking. This was not going to be the easy day she had imagined. She had no idea that her actions would soon catch up with her in the most unexpected way. Mrs. Whitmore sat in the courtroom, her confidence slowly slipping away. She looked at Judge Carter, who was now sitting at the bench. He stared at her with calm, steady eyes. Mrs. Whitmore tried to hold her head high, but inside she was filled with unease. She had never felt so small. The court began. The prosecutor presented the evidence. Witnesses who had seen the whole incident on the Canal Bridge. They spoke of how Mrs. Whitmore had driven recklessly and knocked Mr. Carter off his bicycle, throwing him into the water. They described how she had laughed and driven away without offering any help. Mrs. Whitmore tried to argue, but her words seemed weak and empty. She tried to explain that it was just an accident, but everyone in the room could see the truth. The witnesses knew the woman's actions had been cruel. Even her expensive lawyer couldn't save her. Then it was Judge Carter's turn to speak. He stood up, his voice strong and clear. He talked about respect, about how every person, no matter their race or age, deserves to be treated with dignity. He reminded Mrs. Whitmore that wealth and power didn't make someone above the law. He told her that no one should ever think they can harm others without facing the consequences. Mrs. Whitmore's face turned bright red. She tried to hold back tears, but she couldn't. Judge Carter's words cut deep. The courtroom was quiet as he handed down the verdict. "Mrs. Whitmore," Judge Carter said, "you are guilty of reckless driving and assault. You will pay for the damages caused and face a community service sentence. It's time to learn that kindness and respect are the real measures of power." The room was silent, and Mrs. Whitmore felt a wave of shame wash over her. The arrogance she had carried all day now seemed foolish. She had thought she could get away with anything, but now she understood. The old man she had disrespected was not just a victim. He was a force of justice. As she left the courtroom, her head hung low. She had learned a powerful lesson that day, one that would stay with her forever. After the trial, Mrs. Whitmore felt like a different person. She had always believed that money and status could protect her from anything. But now she knew better. The shame of what she had done weighed heavily on her heart. For the first time in a long while, Mrs. Whitmore stopped and thought about others. She thought about Mr. Carter, the old man she had treated so badly. She thought about how he had handled everything with dignity and grace, while she had acted out of anger and pride. Days passed, and Mrs. Whitmore couldn't shake the feeling that she had to make things right. She began to change her attitude. At work, she started listening to people more carefully, treating them with kindness and respect. She made an effort to be more thoughtful and less arrogant. One afternoon, she went to the same canal bridge where the incident had happened. She stood there for a long time, looking out at the water. Her mind was full of thoughts. She remembered how she had driven away without caring. Now, she wished she had stopped to help. She wished she had treated Mr. Carter as a human being, not just someone she could push aside. The next day, she decided to find him. She had to apologize. It was the only way to move forward. Mrs. Whitmore located Mr. Carter's office and walked in, her heart pounding in her chest. When she saw him, she was quiet for a moment. She didn't know what to say at first, but then, as he took a deep breath and spoke, "Mr. Carter," she said, "I owe you an apology. What I did to you was wrong. I hurt you, and I am deeply sorry. I've learned a lot since then, and I want to make things right." Mr. Carter looked at her, his eyes calm but kind. "We all make mistakes," he said. "What matters is what we do after." That day, Mrs. Whitmore realized that true change comes from within. She had made the first step by admitting her mistake, but the real work was in how she treated others from then on. The kindness she had shown that day wasn't just for Mr. Carter. It was for everyone around her. She had truly transformed. As she left, Mrs. Whitmore felt lighter, more at peace. She knew she wasn't perfect, but she had taken the first step toward becoming a better person. And that was something worth being proud of. We hope you enjoyed this story and learned a lesson. For more related stories, please subscribe our channel. And don't forget to like, share, and comment. Thanks for watching.